Hello everyone, welcome to the fourth module in this series, which enables you to access the acceptability thresholds of quality traits for roots, tubers and bananas. It was produced by DEUSCHER and revised by Christophe BUGAUD and ADINSI Laurent. In this module, we will explain how to carry out quantitative descriptive sensory analysis and instrumental measurements as part of the RTB Breeding project. If you wish to quote from this presentation, please do so as written at the bottom of this slide. We will start with the section on sensory analysis and more specifically on quantitative descriptive analysis. It's important to remember that sensory evaluation is a science defined by an ISO standard, and its definition is as follows. Science relating to the examination of the organoleptic or sensory properties of a product by the sense organs, vision, hearing, touch, smell, and taste. The aim is to describe the nature, intensity, quality, complexity, duration, and chronology of sensations perceived when tasting food or drink in terms of visual, gustatory, olfactory, auditory if relevant, and tactile aspects. Compared with other scientific methods, sensory evaluation is unique in that it uses the human subject as a measuring instrument. As sensory evaluation is a standardized scientific method, there are many precautions to be taken when selecting products, choosing tests, choosing subjects, their number, then training, and so on. Sensory evaluation is divided into two main approaches. The first one is the hedonic approach. It studies with consumers the acceptability or preference of a food product through the pleasure derived from its tasting or consumption. My previous tutorial concerned this type of test. The second approach is analytical. It specifically measures the sensory characteristics of a product using the human subject as a measuring instrument. This approach is used to study differences between products. The QDA I'm going to talk about today is one such analytical method. Here are the different points of the QDA test, which I will go into more detail in the rest of this presentation. Next, we will talk about the panel, which is a very important point in this presentation. After that, we will talk about the environment in which the test is to be carried out, the design of the QDA questionnaire, its practical implementation, and finally, data processing. The choice of sensory attributes used in the QDA test depends on the products you have selected. Normally, the sensory attributes of the various products have been defined in the product profiles of the RTB food projects. You will need to choose a maximum of 4 or 5 different attributes, and for each of them, you will need to establish a simple definition that the judges can understand. The second point, very important for the QDA test, is the panel. We expect the different judges who make up our panel to be able to understand the definitions of the terms used to describe the products, to be able to recognize the different sensations in the food, and to ensure repeatability, reproducibility, and discrimination. The explanations I'm going to give you in the following sections on the panel are taken from the publication referenced here. And I won't go into as much detail as in the publication, so if you need any further clarification, I invite you to go have a look at that document. A French version also exists for French speakers. Before you can obtain your final panel, you must first recruit and train the judges. To do this, you will need to pre-select more than twice as many judges as you will need for your final study. How will you choose them? According to different selection criteria. Firstly, the person's interest and motivation to take part in this type of study. Then their behavior towards food products and their behavior in general. People must be persistent, punctual, reliable, and honest. It's important that they have good communication skills and are in good health. Last but not least, they must be available to take part in this study. The first training session should explain the role of sensory analysis. This first session will also be an opportunity to explain the general tasting instructions, to explain to candidates the recruitment procedure, and to explain the general approach to monitoring judges, the types of tests, and the frequency of sessions. During this first session, subjects are also introduced to the basic of sensory physiology. During the second session, a retro-olfaction test is carried out. This shows the judges the difference between smell, flavor, and aroma, and explains the phenomena that occur during olfaction and tasting. Finally, a series of sensory tests are carried out to select and train the judges. 6 tests are set up to finalize the selection of judges and train them. The first test on the identification of taste and impressions is set up to determine the sensitivity of the candidates. Next, a fundamental taste classification test is carried out to train subjects to use an intensity scale working on dilutions of sweet and salty taste. The aim of the third test is to determine each judge's individual perception threshold for the fundamental tastes acid, bitter, and astringency, assess their sensitivity, and train them to use an intensity scale. This test makes subjects aware of their own taste sensitivity. The fourth test is a triangular test, which tests the candidate's ability to discriminate between samples. The fifth test aims to teach subjects how to evaluate and identify odors, to teach them to use the appropriate vocabulary and thus enable them to improve their individual aptitude. Finally, there is a fruit puree description test to check whether subjects have an objective opinion of the product presented. After the general training, the tasters are trained on a matrix during 4 training sessions. For this, 3 or 4 products similar to those you want to evaluate later in your QDA test are chosen. In the first 2 sessions, panelists will learn the definitions of the main quality traits as sensory descriptors and how to rate them on the entire rating scale. After these 2 sessions, there will be a joint discussion and a correction will be made by the moderator to recalibrate panelists who were unable to place themselves correctly on the scale. During the next 2 sessions, the test will be carried out under real-life conditions with a batch of 3 contrasting products, which will be the same for both sessions. The results of this test will be used to assess the panel's performance. Using the results of the last 2 training sessions, we can look at the panel's performance. There are 3 elements to check: the panelist's repeatability, its agreement with the rest of the panel, and its ability to discriminate samples. For more details on how performance is calculated, please consult this paper published in 2022. The repeatability associated with sensory analysis is defined as a measure of the agreement obtained during evaluations carried out on the same sample under identical conditions. We say that the repeatability is effective if the deviation between 2 observations is less than or equal to 2 on a rating scale of 0 to 10. After repeatability, we need to check the agreement between panelists. This measures the homogeneity of the response obtained for the same stimulus by the different tasters. Agreement is said to be effective if 70% of the difference between the panel mean and the panelist mean for an identical product evaluated twice is less than the panel standard deviation. Finally, the panelist discrimination must be verified. This is the ability to detect sensory differences between products. It's closely linked to repeatability, since the lower the level of repeatability, the more difficult it is to be discriminating. Once you've selected all the panelists, you need to find a place to carry out the QDA test, ideally in a sensory laboratory. QDA testing should be carried out in specially designed rooms with individual test booths. Cabins, floors, and walls must be easy to clean with neutral decoration. The room atmosphere must be controlled, including light, temperature, humidity, odor, and noise. Before carrying out your QDA analysis, you will need to prepare the questionnaire on which the panelists will evaluate your products. To do this, you need to have decided on the number of samples your judges will taste, the number of repetitions of the same product they will make, and the order in which you will present the samples to your judges. Don't forget to anonymize your samples by giving them a 3-letter or 3-digit code. Then you can prepare the questionnaire with the sensory descriptors. Different types of scale can be used in sensory analysis. For the purpose of this project, a graduated scale from 0 to 10, using whole numbers only, will be used by each taster to rate the intensity of each descriptor. On the right, you can see an example of a questionnaire for boiled plantain. On this example, you can see that there is a space available for noting the sample code, and further down on the sheet are the rating scales for the 3 descriptors. When you want to carry out your QDA analysis, you will need to call a minimum of 12 panelists from among those who have been trained and selected after performance checks. On the day of the test, they must be in good health, avoid wearing perfumes, refrain from smoking, drinking, or eating in the hour preceding the test, be on time, remain silent during the test, rinse their mouths with water between each sample, and above all, read the questionnaire carefully to make sure they don't forget to answer any questions. Regarding the product samples to be tasted by your panel, you must first check their sanitary quality. Next, you will need to ensure that you have enough products to carry out the hedonic test, the instrumental analysis, and the QDA test for all the judges and replicates. Then you will need to check the homogeneity of the food. For example, if you're working with several tubers or banana of one variety, you need to make sure that they are all homogeneous. The product you'll be tasting should be as natural as possible. For example, if you're analyzing boiled products, you shouldn't add salt. The food should remain as natural as possible. When preparing samples, you also need to consider the convenience of storage, transport if necessary, presentation, and consumption. If you choose to have your product tasted when it's hot, you need to be able to measure its temperature and keep the food at the temperature you decide until the moment of instrumental analysis and tasting by panelists for the QDA and by consumers for the hedonic test. It's very important to maintain the same temperature between the different analyses, as we know that it can have a strong impact on the texture of certain products. On the day of the QDA analysis, before the panelists arrive, you will need to set up the boxes in which they will be seated. This means setting out plates, cutlery, napkins, a glass of water, a pen, the questionnaire to be filled in, the consent questionnaire, and the definition list. Then, when the panelists arrive, you will have to welcome them and explain the study in its entirety without giving away any details. Then explain the task to be carried out. Then the QDA test can begin, so you can distribute the samples in the order defined according to the presentation plan you've chosen beforehand. You will need to bring the samples one after the other to each panelist. Don't forget to distribute water regularly to the panelists so they can rinse their mouths between samples. When the panelists have finished tasting the different samples, check that they have answered all the questions and thank them for their participation. Then they can leave the room. After performing a QDA, you first need to enter your results into this type of table. The first column of the table indicates all the panelists from 1 to 12, for example. The second column is the sample they tasted, the third the repetition of the sample, and the following columns are the perceived intensity of each descriptor. In this example, the panelists tested sample number 1 and carried out 3 repetitions of this sample. On the first line of the table, these are the results of the first panelist's first repetition of sample 1. He found that the sweet taste had an intensity of 7, a firmness of 2, and a wetness of 4. Once you have this table with all your data, you can calculate the mean intensity of the descriptors in each sample. This is what you can see here in the second table. I have finished the section on QDA, and I will now turn to the section of instrumental analysis. For this part, I have extracted the various information from this review, whose references are noted at the bottom of the page so that you can download it. If you have any questions about this section, please don't hesitate to contact the first author, whose email address is on the first page of the publication. In the RTB food and RTB breeding projects, various SOPs have been written on instrumental methods for accessing color, such as colorimetry, sweetness, by measuring sugar and organic acid content, and texture. For texture, several methods are available, such as TPA, extrusion, penetration, and others. What's important when calculating acceptability thresholds is to know which instrumental analysis method measures which sensory descriptor. If we want to be able to link instrumental and sensory analysis, we need to ensure that they measure the same sensory descriptor. On this slide and the next one, you can see information taken from the publication I showed you on slide 18. On these two slides, you can see which instrumental methods measure which descriptors on which matrix. This table is not exhaustive, and the methods shown here are only suggestions. I would point out that it's not always essential to use several methods to capture the same sensory traits. This slide is a continuation of the previous one, and it's the next part of the table. This is the end of this presentation, and here are a few general points to remember about this presentation. QDA is a sensory analysis method performed in the laboratory. When carrying out this analysis, you will need to use the same raw material as for the hedonic tests. So you will need to perform both analyses in parallel. You will also need to use the same sensory descriptors corresponding to the same quality criteria as those used for the hedonic tests. Then you will need a panel of judges who are trained to be repeatable, discriminating, and in agreement with each other. In the QDA, these judges are asked to rate the perceived intensity of each descriptor on a scale from 0 to 10. Finally, to measure acceptability thresholds, be sure to use instrumental measurements that measure the same descriptors as those evaluated in sensory analysis. Thank you for following this fourth module, and have a good day. See you soon.